list. So we've got the first one and the second one. And I told you that since Python is object-oriented, I could add these lists together. And now it knows how to do list math. I get a big list of everything. So you can see object-oriented access to these. I can also, my sphere, I can get just the transform, or I can get the shape, because it's the first index or the second index, and I told you that the indexes always start at 0. And I can say how many items in this list. There's 2. Show you some more really cool commands, some basic commands. I'm going to create one more sphere. I'm going to call it sphere 3. We'll give this one a radius of 5 or something like that. Doesn't really matter. So we've got 3 spheres in here. Clean this up a little bit. So we've got 3 spheres. Now here's another cool command. Commands.ls. And ls is similar to on Linux, Unix, Mac OS. ls is a list command. It's a way you can list things in the scene. So we can list with no arguments, just lists everything. But we can actually fine-tune this, and we can say just list, and if you remember, we can actually type ls right here, and we get all the ways we can actually limit specific items. And one of the cool things is here is you could limit by type. So I can say type equals, and I could limit this by a NURB surface, since that's what we happen to have right here. So I can say give me back all NURB surface objects. Oops, I did equal. That's not, we don't want to do that. So if we hit enter, we get back a list of the 3 NURB surfaces that we created. And we can save this into spheres. And now we've got our list, we've got it saved. And we can loop over it, and we can do stuff with it. And if you remember how to do a loop, it was for. And we can say anything we want here. This sphere in spheres. Tab to go in, because you have to indent in Python. Print this sphere. I can select this code, hit enter, and it loops over each one and it prints it. Now we could do more things to this. We could change the size of the sphere, the other properties of the sphere. But I want to show you another command that's really useful, and that's the select. Commands select. Now if you look, when I select one of these, it's printing out the mel. So this is a great way, and actually before I get into this, I want to kind of jump over into how to learn as you go. And what you can do is you can perform operations and see the mel that gets spit out, and then you can do a whole set of operations and get the mel out of it and build your scripts repetitively with those commands. So you can see the select, and it's using the -r, which means replace everything else with this new selection. Now the Python equivalent, if we actually go into our help, we type select, we can go down to the bottom and we can see some really great examples of how to do a select. And you can see that you do select with the item you want to select and then the flags that follow. So what we can do is switch back over here, and we can say, so we're going to loop for this loop in spheres. So every time we go in the loop, the new sphere is called this sphere. We can select it, this sphere. We can tell it to replace anything else that was selected. That's kind of nice to do. And you can type select here, and let's look at the R flag, replace. It doesn't tell us, but it's a Boolean. If we look in our help, let's see here, replace Boolean. Remember, Boolean is true or false. So replace true, do a replace. And we can run this, and it would go through each of these and select them. And so it happened so fast you couldn't see it, and the last one that it ended with is the one that's still selected. But while it's selected, you can do anything like setting attributes to things that have to be selected. You could move it and do all kinds of things to affect it. And now I've said being able to set the attributes more than once, so let's actually see how we can set attributes. I'm going to go down a little bit out of the way. We're not going to worry about this code up here for a second, but I'm going to show you how you can change all the attributes. Now, if you, again, want to see visually how you could do that, let's go into our channel here. And sorry about the screen size. I have to work with a limited space for the screen capture. But if I select this sphere, and you see it, we're selecting. And if I let's translate it a bit. Let's move it closer to the camera, and you can see it spit out the set attribute. And what it did is it spit out, first you have to give it the name of the object, and then dot the attribute. And if you remember, this is kind of object oriented, even though Mel isn't. The syntax right here fits perfectly with Python because this is a child attribute of this object. And then you give it the new value. And the way we do that in Python is commands set adder, and then we can either give it the name of the sphere, or if you remember, we have, for instance, we have this value already, and it needs to be given the actual transform because that's where this lives. So what we want to do is, now I'm going to put this in here and I'm going to show you what happens. We're going to set it to 5, and I already know this is going to not work, but I want to show you why. Now, we ran something incorrectly and it gave us what's called a traceback, and this tells us what happened, why it happened. We gave it a type error. That means that we gave it a bad type. It didn't like it, and it's saying that invalid argument 1 right here, and it tells us what it was, and it expected a different type. So what we actually want to do is, if you remember, this is the value of my sphere. What we want is this, and we want to say 0, but we also need to add the attribute name. So we can't do it like this. What we need to do is fix it first. So let's go up here to this line, and let's say my sphere 3 0. Okay, cool. So we got the transform, but we want to add on this bit of the string, translate z. And you remember that strings can be added together. So now that we've taken this from a list to the first element of the list, which is a string, I can add translate z with a dot. There we go. There's the string we want, and we could just say my adder. I do a lot of my because it's a good way to illustrate at this moment that it's my attribute. So we've got this saved. Let's put it right here. I'm going to move this over. Let's run it, and you see that it moved. And we can set it to 10. So what you see is we replicated the same mel command in Python. They just kind of swap the positions of things around, but you'll get the hang of how the object usually goes first, followed by all the flags and arguments and options that follow it. And obviously we can not only do the set adder, but we can also do the get adder. If we just change this to a G, and when it goes blue like this, it's kind of telling you that you got the right command because it knows all the members of this command. So that's kind of helpful with the coloring. But if I take off this value, because we don't want to set anything, we're just getting the attribute. If I select that, it tells us the current value. And I could save this to, let's call it sphere tx. Now I have this result, and I could do things to it. I could say, well, in our loop, maybe we want to move it forward. Oh, my mistake. TZ. Thanks for pointing that out, by the way. So we've got 20. Okay, great. So we're kind of onto something, which means we can move back up here into our loop before, where we were looping over every sphere, and we were doing something with it. We were selecting it. But instead of selecting it, let's use what we were already doing down here, up here. So every time we loop, we're going to get, see what spheres here. Spheres is the shape nodes. And actually, that's not what we want in this case. What we want is the transforms, right? So we got to format that first. We actually have to, what we should have done is every time we save these, we should have taken the first item. So let's do that real quick. Let's create a new list. Let's say, now if you remember, my sphere, we have all these my spheres, and my sphere 0 is what we want, right? So let's create a new list. Let's say spheres equals new list, and then we're going to say spheres, my mistake here, spheres dot, and I could hit the control space and it tells me append. I'm starting to type append just like from the examples, and let's do my sphere 0. Oops, we forgot to do this first and put an R in there. Now what happened to, we had an empty list and we appended, we got our first item in there. We could also do, let's do it 2 more times. 1, 2. Let's run these. Now what happened here? We actually, oh, my mistake. We're doing this wrong here. It's actually using the same list over and over. That's not what we wanted. Let's clear our list. Let's start over. And what we actually want is my sphere 1, or 2, 3, and we want the first item of each of those. You remember we ran this 3 times. Sphere, sphere 2, sphere 3. So we can select this whole thing, hit enter. Let's see what spheres is now. Awesome, we've got our transforms. We've got our transforms, which means we can move down our code where it's going to loop over each of these spheres. And what we're going to do is we're going to get the current commands, get, and I can hit control space. Let's get the current attribute, and let's actually first remember we need to, what we need to do is we need to build it. So let's grab this code. See how it's great? We can just kind of shift code around in here and learn outside and then kind of construct things that work. So we're going to say on this loop, my attribute is this sphere plus translate z, and then we're going to get the attribute current tz. Call it anything we want. It's, in this loop, it's only this is only alive for now. In this loop, every time we loop over. So then we get the current z, and then we're going to move it forward. Let's say current tz equals. Let's move it forward another 10. Now, while I'm doing this little operation, I can show you a little shortcut in Python. This right here saying this current tz equals itself plus 10 can actually be shortened to just plus equals 10. That means add 10 into this value. Now that we have a new value for current tz, we're going to commands set attribute my attribute current tz. Okay? So let's again look at what this is going to do. We have our list of transforms. We're going to loop over that list of transforms, and every time it loops, the current one is stored in this variable. We're going to create an attribute name by adding the value of that string plus the attribute. So that's the current attribute. We're going to get the current value of translate z and store it here. We're going to add 10 to it, and we're going to set it back. So watch what happens with all these spheres right here. I'm going to select this code right here, hit return, and they moved. Now if I keep hitting it, they're leaving the screen completely. See, I can zoom out. They're leaving because we're constantly adding 10 more. So I could even turn this into a function. And if you remember, we were doing a function with the def keyword, move spheres, and you do parentheses, and that's where we would put our arguments if we wanted any, colon. Now, we need to indent this because you remember we jump into the function. So I select all this, and I hit tab, and that moves everything over for me. Tab is what moves this over. So we're making this function called move spheres, and it's going to loop over these spheres, and it's going to do all this. But the problem is that spheres is only alive as a variable within this function. So we actually need to make spheres something we can pass in. Everything else we make on the fly, and we can make this an attribute later, but for the example, we need to pass spheres in because this sphere is, again, is only alive inside this function. So we have our spheres out here, we have our function. Let's make this. Now it didn't do anything. What it did is it created a function for us. See, we have a new function that we could use, and I'm going to grab all these here. Oops, sorry. Sorry about that. My mouse wheel was kind of being weird. So let's do that again here. So we're moving it over here. I'm going to select these, and I'm going to set the z's back to 0. So we actually have something that we can see here. All right. So we've got our function, right? And let's go down here, clear out some space, and we've got our spheres list, right? We made that up here. We've got this function that we can reuse. So what we can do now is we can say move spheres, and we pass in our list of spheres. So this could have been called anything, and just to prove that, I'm going to change this to values, just because it could be called anything, and we just have to call it values while we're inside the function, right? Just to show you that we're passing in our spheres from out here, and when they get inside the function, they're going to be called values. So if I run this, you notice it keeps moving the spheres. It's looping over all of these and setting the spheres. So that gives us a really good example of a lot of the ideas we went over in making a function, doing a loop, passing in arguments, adding strings, getting the return value of the get attribute, adding to it with the new little way to do add, which you could also do a minus here, times, divide, all that for the math, and then setting that value back, and then having our nice function call right here. Now what I want to do is go back to our example scene that we had before in our projects directory in the Canon deck project, the Canon deck broken scene. Let's open this up just because it's something more visual than spheres. Let's look at it here. So we've got this scene, and what I wanted to do is, going a little further with our loops and some commands, something actually usable is, what if we wanted to select all the lights in the scene with Python? Let's open up a new tab. It's under the command, new tab, and it gives you an option if you want a Mel or a Python tab. So let's do Python, and we still got our old code over here, but we can move into a new fresh tab. And so we've got all these lights in the scene, and we want to select them all. So what we can do is going to do the ls command. So we want to list all the lights first. So let's type commands dot ls, and let's get some help on that. And ls has a ton of ways that you can look for different objects. But if you see, one of the ways is you could just say lights. So you can say ls lights. Now what does lights take? Let's open up our documentation. ls. And let's look at lights. It takes a Boolean, true or false. So it's a flag. We want to say true. If I select this, hit enter, here's all our lights. So let's create an example of looping over all our lights and changing their intensity. Let's have their intensity. Let's cut them in half. So what we want to do is we want to ls, we get all the lights. Let's save them into a variable called lights. And then let's loop over each one and set their intensity. Now how do we know how to set their intensity? Well, let's do a little experimentation. We can pick one of these lights and we can go into the attributes. Oops. And we go to the attributes. Now my window's kind of small, so I have to look at this closely. Here's the intensity. And if we just set it to itself, we can see really easily how to set the intensity. It's the intensity attribute, and you just pass it a float. And so what we do is we do our for loop for L, or we could say for light, in lights. And that's going to loop over our light list, and enter, tab. So for each light, we want to get the original intensity, intense equals commands.get adder. And what do we want to get? Now we want to get the intensity. Now another way you can get the attribute is get attribute works if you put dot intensity and we don't build a string with the name of the node, it's going to work on whatever's selected. So here's another way that you could do this. You could commands.select the light, and you remember that that R means replace everything else. You saw that when we were doing this right here, replace the previous selection. So now it's going to select that light, and now we've got the current light, and we can just say dot intensity, and that'll automatically do it on the current selection. So we want to get the current intensity. Then we want to say new intensity equals, and we want to do half. So we want to do intense times 0.5. And that will give us a new intensity. And then we can go back and say commands set attribute dot intensity new intensity. And so theoretically, when we run this whole thing, it should loop over every light and have the intensity. So let's hit this. And what we could even do as a bit of feedback is after we set each one, we can use our print command and we can say print, let's say print the light, comma, because you can separate your elements by commas. Old equals intense, new equals new intensity. Let's run this and see what we get. I'm going to clear this area so we can have a fresh canvas here. So I'm going to hit enter. Now, what happened here? Did I misspell? I misspelled something. Intensity, intensity, intensity. See, Python helps you out. Tells you that there was a name error. New intensity is not defined. That told you that on line 6, you see on line 6, it got to line 6, and I had a bad name here. So I knew that I needed to fix the naming. So I'm going to hit enter. And you can see what happened is it looped over every light, and it told you that was the old value, that was the new value. So what's really cool is we didn't have to go through each light and select it and do the math and figure out what half of each one is. We could just loop over each one with a common value to change them all by. And again, we could wrap this up into a function and pass it a list of lights and even another attribute for the intensity to change it to. And that way we have a function for changing all the lights in our scene. And actually, let's do that. Let's turn this function into something where we can use it like a utility. Let's create something called gain lights. And actually, I'm going to undo what I just did to the lights. Put them all back to normal again. Gain lights, and let's make some room. Gain lights, and then we're going to do parentheses, and this is where we can define what attributes we want to take. So I think the first attribute should be the lights list, right? And then the second attribute we could put is the gain that we want to apply. So I do our colon, and then select this here, tab in. The space here is perfectly fine. You can have spaces to separate and make it more readable. And now lights is now called lights list, so we need to make sure that we use the right list inside our command. And what else do we need to change? Well, we have this hard-coded 0.5 right here, but now we want to make this a variable so that you can call it with any type of intensity. So what we would do is take this gain value, put it right here as a placeholder, and then we can select everything, hit enter. We now have a new function, right? And this new function just takes a list of lights. So what I can do is I can call gain lights with, and you remember we got our listing. We would do this outside to figure out what lights we actually want to use. So in this case, we just selected all lights in the scene. I can call this, right? And now if I hit enter, we're going to get an error because we have to take two arguments. How much do we want to gain the lights? Let's gain it by 2. Let's double the brightness of everything in the scene. And look at that. And then we could run it again with 0.5. And it drops everything down into half. So you can see that now we have this cool function. And if we were to, let me get rid of this. Let me get rid of this. Now if we were just to take this script, actually I didn't even need to do that. I will just select, because the save function works on whatever you select. I could say File, Save Script, and let's call it Gain Lights. And this doesn't have to be the only thing. You could save lots of functions, and when you're starting out, this is pretty much how you will write your utilities, because you can get more advanced in Python, but to start out, you just need these functions just to get you going. So you can make a whole file full of utility functions, right? And so what I can do then is I can load this script in, and then I just have gain lights now. So anywhere in my code, I can just gain lights. And I can always just load it right back in. Right, there's our gain lights tool. But to actually use this, if this Maya had been freshly started, let's actually just prove that right now. Let's see what happens here. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to close Maya. I'm not going to save. Right? And then I'm going to open up my scene again. And this is something that we'll get to later in the video, but it's something that I just want you to be aware of right now. So when I load up Maya again, and I try to run my gain lights function, it doesn't exist because it's never been entered into Maya's interpreter yet. We have the code here because it was saved from last time, and if it wasn't here we could have loaded it, but for now what you would have to do manually is run that, and now you have this function all over Maya anywhere. Even from right here you could run that gain lights command. But later on in the video I'm going to show you where you can put these scripts so that you can import them just like a module, so that you could do something like import Justin's utils, and then we would get Justin's